Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Reputation Room. Today, we have one of the sharpest minds out there when it comes to commenting on how business and business leaders communicate and connect with their audiences. She and I have only known each other for a few weeks. However, that was enough for me to decide that I wanted her to be a guest for this podcast. Call it Love at First Sight. I'm talking about Jennifer George. Until very recently, Jen was Senior Vice President Comms for the Aspen Group, a U.S. business operating brands spanning dental, aesthetics, urgent care, and pet health. Her career spans healthcare, consumer, wellness, beauty, yet most importantly, at least in my view, she's the author of the CCO Dispatch. The CCO Dispatch is a daily newsletter that she publishes on LinkedIn and that you can subscribe to anytime. Its tagline says, Global Intelligence for the Communicator Advising Leadership. If I may, I think the tagline undersells the brilliance of the thinking and the writing. And I wanted to prove my point by having her with us today so you all can enjoy her perspective. Jen, no pressure. Welcome to the Reputation Room.
Thank you for having me, Javier. I'm so excited to be here with you.
You're very welcome, Jen. Super excited to have you with us today. So listen, let's start from the end. Why the CCO Dispatch?
Great question. I mean, the honest answer is it started as self-preservation in some ways. So to go back to March when I launched the Dispatch, I had just moved to the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi 2 weeks beforehand. Me and my two kids were displaced. So we were staying in Cambodia. The Iran, Middle East, US conflict had just escalated. Oil had hit, like $120 a barrel, and the Strait of Hormuz was still closed. And I'm sitting in this hotel room just watching the news get worse by the hour. And I personally needed an outlet that wasn't just, doom scrolling. And so I started writing and thinking about what do I actually know how to do, which is look at the news and ask, what does this mean for the communicators who have to explain everything that's happening in the geopolitical and macroeconomic environment to their principals, tomorrow. And it's funny that, I went back and forth, like, should this be weekly? Should this be daily? And the format was actually pretty deliberate. I'm sure you'll remember most of us in communications grew up doing our daily media monitoring work, pouring through the print versions of, the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, whatever was in your stack. And there was something about that daily cadence that made you feel informed and ready for the day. And I wanted to recreate that feeling, but make it shareable and specific to the CCO's job. And so if you're advising leadership, you can't wait a week to think and ruminate about something. You have to be ready for that meeting today. Mm-hmm. So the news cycle, it matters to a communications leader, like the crisis that just broke, or the CEO who just said something, or that regulatory development that totally changes your industry's posture, that moves daily. And so a weekly filter on that, it wouldn't be as useful as a daily read. And so that's really how it started. And I have to say, we've got almost 8,000 subscribers now, mm-hmm. which is incredible just since March. So, it's my hope is that it continues to serve as a useful tool for leaders everywhere. And I think it shows you that there's a real appetite for something that treats communicators as the strategic operators that they actually are.
Yeah, and congratulations on the more than 8,000. And I have to say, when I subscribed, Jen, you were at, I think it was a little bit over 6,000. So
look at you, OG, Javier, you're an OG subscriber, a VIP.
Exactly. So it's been 2,000 that you increased in probably maybe a month and a half now. So really well done.
Yeah, there's a real appetite there.
And listen, you brought me back to the beginnings of my career when you talk about the clipping books. I started my career stapling clipping books.
Oh yeah, totally. Do you remember like cutting out the mastheads and taping them onto the
pure art.
You're right. We are artists.
Absolutely. So listen, Jen, this podcast sits at the intersection of reputation, business, and leadership, right? Um, and I would argue that that is something that you either implicitly or explicitly address every day in some way, shape, or form in your newsletter. How did you get to the level of expertise that you have? And also, let me make a remark here. What clearly comes across in your posts and in your writing is that you are super well informed, right? So
I try really hard to be.
tell us more about what process do you follow to get there, and also how did you build the expertise behind it?
Well, what's interesting is, typically what you see is communications leaders have deep industry expertise, and I actually do not.
Mm-hmm.
I spent the first decade of my career on the agency side of the business. Nestle, Deloitte, Hilton, and then decided to get my MBA. Lived in China for a bit as part of that program, and then went in-house. Worked in agriculture and in the very complex issue of water rights. Moving to beauty at Unilever, tech, and now healthcare. And I did not plan my career this way, but I think as I reflect on it, moving through industries has forced, I think, a kind of pattern recognition that you can't really, it's hard to develop if you're staying in one place.
Mm-hmm.
When you're somewhere new, you have to figure out very fast what is actually true about how this business works. Who are the real stakeholders? Where does the reputation risk actually live? What is this particular, what is this specific leadership team afraid of that they're not saying out loud? You don't have the luxury of institutional knowledge, so you develop instincts, and you get very good at walking into a room you've never been in before and reading it quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I think what I noticed after doing that enough times is the underlying problems are very similar. The industry context changes and the acronyms change and all that is true. But the gap between what an organization says it is and what it actually does, that is everywhere. The CEO or, name the C-suite exec who has to be told that the decision they just made has a human being on the other side of it, that's everywhere. The comms team that's being asked to polish something that isn't ready to be polished, that's everywhere. So the expertise, if I have it, is I think in that pattern recognition, seeing it quickly and naming it clearly and just knowing from having been in enough different rooms what actually moves the needle versus maybe what just feels like progress. And then you mentioned process. What I would say to that is curiosity is a professional discipline, not just a personality trait. I am genuinely almost pathologically interested, mm-hmm. nosy, if you will, in how things work. Businesses, people, decisions, the news, why something landed the way it did. I think the dispatch is that same instinct with an audience. So every morning I sit down voraciously with the digital forms of my formerly printed stack, mm-hmm. And write my way to understanding what I actually think about it. And so much of that is, it's not even research, it's like excavation work. When I see something about, I don't know, like an earnings call, right? Or a new announcement, I get really curious about, okay, how long has the CEO been in this position? Mm-hmm. Where was he or she before? What are some of the external factors that might be influencing the word choice that they just used? So it's sort of like, it's a little bit of like business archaeology, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And I love the characterization, business archaeology. I was going to say, Jen, let's talk about those patterns. Because now that you've been doing this and in such a disciplined fashion over the course of 4 or 5 months. Let me ask you, what are the top 3 common mistakes that you are seeing?
There's so many. I think there's probably like 3 or 4. I think the first that I continue to observe in different ways is that communications is often asked to manufacture credibility the organization does not have.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot write your way out of a values gap. You cannot PR your way out of a real operational failure. And I've seen that before in my own experience. And so I think, for example, when I was at Headspace, which is a mental health platform,
Mm-hmm.
we had this extraordinary product that genuinely changed how people related to their own mental health. And the communication worked. It was so powerful because the product worked, right? The stories we were telling were true. And so when the story is true, your job as a communicator is just to make sure it gets seen by the right people in the right way. And that is an amazing job. That's also much easier than the alternative. But, I think the other constant and where I also tend to see some of this come up is that reputation is also always a lagging indicator of operational decisions that were made somewhere between, let's say, like 6 months and 2 years ago, roughly. And so by the time you're managing a reputation crisis, the real decision has already happened. The product shipped, the policy was put into place, the hire was made, whatever. You are now downstream of all of that. And so what I've been seeing quite a lot of is it's almost, some of it is in the crisis response itself, but it's really around the decision making and how the consequences of that, flow through the entire financial model. And I'm sure you've sat in enough rooms. I've sat in plenty of these rooms watching decisions get made where the human dimension is just not a variable that anybody is calculating. And it's not out of malice. It's because the people in the room are optimizing for things, that maybe they're responsible for measuring or that can be measured. And so often, the comms leader is responsible for measuring something completely different. And that's only valuable if the communications team is valued and present before the decision actually happens. So I think it's really, what I'm seeing, it really kind of boils down to the gap between what the organization says it believes in and then what is actually happening. The other piece I think we're just continuing to see more and more of is just this sort of lack of discipline and understanding and coherence around AI. And that's certainly not a failure of any one organization. I think it's a collective failure, quite honestly. And if you think about the human dimension of that, it is employees for, because that's, I think, the first sort of line that we're seeing here. But it certainly is flowing through to consumers, to communities, because you're seeing it play out in what's happening with data centers, right? And some of the hyperscalers. And so just complete sort of lack of investment in community relations. So I think it all comes back to that gap that we've continued to see.
Yeah, you made me think of a remark of one of past guests of this podcast. This notion that around the idea of the chief comms officer being a connector between business and societal logic.
I loved that. I heard that it was such a great line. Who was that? That was your first podcast, I think.
I think it was
Joao
on the first podcast.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, which resonates and it's very much connected to what you were saying.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, Jen, your style is very unique. It's personal. It's authentic. It's very recognizable. How did you develop it?
Honestly, I think of my writing style almost as a way of thinking. Like, writing for me is how I process and think through perspectives and poke holes in arguments. And so I think it is a reflection of that. I grew up the daughter of teenage parents. So my first job at like 11 was working at my dad's motorcycle shop, selling tires and spark plugs to much older biker dudes. If you can picture that, like this 12-year-old girl with braces, on a motorcycle shop floor. But you understand immediately that the first impression was not going to do any work for me. Like nobody walks in there and thinks, oh, she's the one I want advice on my Harley from, You either learn very fast how to build trust through how you communicate, or you don't sell anything and you just go home. And so I always think, when it comes to writing style, I always think about the audience first, which is, I think, why my style has always had a bit of like real talk meets practical advice, because that's how I would brief a CEO. That's how I would show up to, executive, an ELT meeting with my sort of horizon scanning insights.
Mm-hmm. Real talk meets practical advice. Love that. Super well connected, big follower base, subscribers increasing exponentially. Tell me what your peers worry about in today's world. Any insights?
Oh, yeah. The word I keep hearing in different forms is uncertainty. And it's not even about any one thing. It's not like AI. It's really about everything all at once. It's like, what does the role look like in 2 years? Will the function continue to get funded, or will it be hollowed out? Is AI making us more valuable or more replaceable? And what's interesting from my conversations with a lot of folks is this uncertainty. It's not coming from the lack of sophistication or understanding or knowledge. These are smart, experienced, very, very senior people. The uncertainty is coming from, in some ways, the pace. Like things are just moving so much faster than anyone's institutional playbook was ever written for. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but one of the things I find most fascinating, and maybe also most ironic, is, because I'm seeing this in day-to-day conversations, is this clearly growing recognition among senior leaders that earned media is having a moment. Like when someone asks their LLM about your company or your CEO or your industry, the answer it generates, as we all know, is built largely on what has been written about you by credible third parties. So obviously earned media. This stuff that, of course, got deprioritized, for the better part of a decade over paid channels, right? And so now you have leaders who are suddenly very interested in earned media again. They want it. But there's this mentality of like, well, we'll just hire somebody to do it, instead of, well, I actually still need to have something real to say. Because of course, to earn media, it means you have to have something of substance to talk about. It means doing things worth covering. It means your CEO has to be willing to take an actual position on something. And I think there's a gap that is creating this sort of uncertainty among communications leaders right now, between this renewed appetite for earned media and the willingness to do what actually generates it. And I say this with zero judgment, because I've lived on both sides of that conversation. It's not laziness. It's just like this mental, it's a shortcut mentality that got very deeply baked in. Paid and owned channels sort of gave everybody that illusion of control. Earned media does not give you control. It gives you credibility, but those are not the same thing. So I think there's quite a lot of trepidation, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of sort of trying to put as much process and governance frameworks in place, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. So there's a real, I think it's mixed, right? Because you see this energy around the importance of communications in this, world. And also we don't have the frameworks, we don't have the maybe measurement tools, the structure around it to actually bring those two pieces together.
Yeah, and one thought on that, also coming out of another conversation I had for the podcast, the also there is a governance and also
Yeah.
an org structure wrinkle to what you said in terms of the willingness for companies to create their own news and create those angles, right? That may be attractive enough for earned media efforts, right? There used to be, or there is still, I believe, a very traditional perspective in terms of how do you communicate what you do to the world using very corporate, a lot of cliche and corporate speak, rather than having talent in-house who are able to spot that thing that is gonna be successful in a potential conversation with X outlet or reporter, right? And
100%.
there's a lot. I mean, I catch myself a little bit surprised when saying this out loud, because I thought that in 2026 we would be well past that, but I see that we're not.
We're not. I mean, I think because I have these conversations a lot. I'm still actually at the Aspen Group. I'm consulting while we search for my my replacement. And one of the things I've observed is that earned media, it requires we give something up, right? The journalist is going to decide whether or not our story is worth telling, which means we don't get to control the angle, we don't control the timing, we don't control, what else ends up in the piece. And for the marketing organizations that have spent a long, a decade plus perfecting, their CPCs and their CPA, where every word is exactly what they approve, that loss of control feels genuinely quite threatening. So, and then the second piece is that, that you hit on is like, real news requires decisions. Like, is your CEO willing to take a position? Is there a product that's actually doing something new? Is there a story that has tension to it? Like none of this is, I can't believe we're still having this conversation, to your point, in 2026.
I know.
But what I see a lot of is like a fake milestone press release, or like a vendor announcement dressed up as some new innovation, track. And so I think, and quite honestly, like the lines between paid and earned are just getting murkier than ever. And so, there's sort of like paid adjacency in some ways with newsrooms shrinking and all of that. And then, I think the other piece is that, the only thing that's going to truly feed, the LLMs is genuine earned credibility built over time. This is not something you switch a light on, you switch budget on and suddenly everything shifts, which means the organizations that have avoided real earned media, or maybe have not prioritized it or invested in it for the last decade, they're now discovering that they've been effectively building on sand.
Yes.
So I agree. And the unwillingness is real. And, it's structural to your earlier point around governance.
It's this tension between control and credibility. That's how I would capture it. Right.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I think that's very well said.
So Jen, going back to your most recent role with Aspen Group, you walk in first day with Aspen Group. What is that one thing that you were not willing to compromise on?
Access. I mean, does the CEO actually want to hear from me, or do they just want someone to execute something that's already been decided? You can feel that in the interview process, by the way. Like, you can feel whether the conversation is about what you would potentially build together, or about whether you can execute on getting, a New York Times feature or something that they've already designed. And I have turned down significant roles because that feeling wasn't there. And I sat across from a principal in an interview and thought, this person doesn't actually want a communications advisor. They want someone to execute on a list of tactical things.
Yeah.
I think that would be number one. Can I give you a second?
Sure.
The other thing I think that you can't compromise on, but is sort of a corollary, I think, to the first, is ensuring that you have resources that are commensurate with the ambition of the business. And I don't mean that like a blank check. I mean it as just an honest conversation about what this organization is actually trying to do and whether the investment in communications and in reputation reflects that. Because I'm sure you've been in this same situation as well, but you've got these enormous goals. You've got maybe some reputational debt, and the infrastructure is not matching.
Yes.
And so the only person that ends up being accountable for that is the comms team. And you'd rather have the conversation about resourcing before you walk in the door, not 6 months later when you're being held accountable for things that, were underfunded from the beginning. So, I usually think about the two non-negotiables for me as being around, like, do I trust this person that I'm sitting across from? Will I have access to that person? Because I need to understand how he or she is thinking about the business and the future and all of the different reputational dynamics at play. Do I believe they'll trust me back? And does the ambition match the investment? And if both of those things are yes, then everything else is solvable.
Yeah.
But, if either one of those is no, then almost nothing else matters.
Critical success factors for sure, and good. That's great advice for anyone thinking about getting a new job. Asking those two questions, right, and finding the answers before you make a call, right? So, Jen, as an incoming CCO or Senior Vice President Communications for the Aspen Group, tell me more. What place did reputation have in that very early conversation when you joined the company?
Every role I've taken as head of comms, I came in because something needed to be built or something needed to be fixed. Sometimes both, but reputation was always the sort of organizing principle. If I think about like Headspace, for example, the reputation work was actually around credibility. People knew of meditation at the time, but didn't think it was relevant to them in a modern age. So our job was to make meditation cool again after 2,000 years, right? And the reputation challenge was proving that the science was real. It wasn't just a fad. You don't need to, it's not about surrounding yourself with crystals. The outcomes are real. And that narrative really earned its way into boardrooms and new market entry, BBC interviews, and then a successful, series C and D, and then exit. At Shutterfly, the reputation work was much more around transformation. We were evolving time from a single consumer brand into a portfolio company with multiple brands serving different customers in different ways. We'd just been taken private by Apollo, a PE firm, and needed to really articulate a growth strategy that investors and the broader market could believe in. So the work, at Shutterfly was sort of translating a really complex portfolio transformation into a coherent strategic story that made the ambition legible. And then at the Aspen Group, I walked in specifically because the company has had reputational debt. A cybersecurity incident a few years ago. There's just broader scrutiny of PE and healthcare brands that need to earn trust back from patients, communities. And what I did there was really build the infrastructure, crisis frameworks, measurement infrastructure. A lot of the tools. You can't fix a reputation problem you can't see. So the first job is just making the problem visible in a way that the organization can act on. But of course, reputation recovery at scale is a long game. And so it moves at the speed of operations, not at the speed of communications. You can build all the right systems, but if the operational reality, hasn't caught up yet, the communications can only do so much. And so I think what's interesting is that reputation has always played a really important role in each one of these sort of examples, but they they exist at different altitudes, and they exist with different dynamics at play. But reputation's always the organizing principle in any sort of narrative as an incoming CCO.
And going back to your point on access to the CEO, I was going to ask, provided you have that access, which is it's a foundation, right? That opens the door for the possibility of building a trusting relationship with the CEO. Now, how do you build that relationship with the CEO?
Oh. I always think about it as you have to sort of tell them they have. This is how I articulate it to my team is you tell them that they have spinach in their teeth. And I mean that as literally as a metaphor. The most valuable thing that you can do and be to a CEO is the person who will tell them the thing nobody else in the room will say. And that sounds obvious, right? Like everyone says they want candid counsel. But the reality is, I'm sure you've seen this, is a lot of executives are surrounded by people who have learned, consciously or not, that maybe agreement is safer or maybe easier than pushback, and it just becomes the path of least resistance. And so you have to be willing to be the person who says the uncomfortable true thing early. And in my experience, most good executives want that. They want the debate. They want someone who will push back with substance, who will, maybe find the hole in the argument respectfully, of course. But what they don't want is someone who performs pushback, who might ask a good question and then immediately agrees with whatever answer they get. The second thing is that I think about a lot is around like horizon scanning. And I don't mean sending your CEO your weekly news digest. I mean being the person who consistently brings them something they didn't know they needed to be preparing for. Or that they didn't know they needed to know it before a board meeting or a big, critical moment. If I'm regularly the person who says, hey, this is coming down the pike, here's why it matters to us and to you, and here's how I'd start to think about it. And if I'm right often enough, then I stop being the comms, just the PR person, the comms person, and I really start to become that trusted advisor.
Yeah.
And those are very different relationships. The second one takes time to build, but it's built through those two things. And then, I think there's also just the delivery piece, right? Which is do what you say you're going to do consistently without drama. CEOs work with a lot of people who are maybe good in a room, but then kind of mysterious when it comes to the actual output.
Yes.
And so if you're the person who says a thing and then produces exactly that thing on time at the quality you discussed, that builds trust very quickly. It sounds basic because it is, but it's also surprisingly rare.
I would agree with that. Delivering is key, right? Walking the talk. I was going to say, back to your point on horizon scanning, I'll take it to the next level, and I'll reference these. I read a white paper a couple of weeks ago from it's called the Scriptorium project. I can share with you offline.
I would love to. Yeah.
And they were talking about how AI can redefine what we call narrative intelligence. And the connection with horizon scanning is as follows, in my view. It's not only about seeing what's coming, but it's also a scenario planning, what that could mean for your brand and for your reputation, so that it can predictively inform the business decisions that need to be made today. Right? And it's a super interesting concept that obviously only with AI and with all the technology that we have within our reach, we can make that happen. But these obviously, I'm not doing justice to the depth of the white paper, but it's really good.
It's fascinating. I mean, there's a couple of them too. There's is it Blackbird?
Yeah.
And there's a couple of
they
others.
reference Blackbird.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
It's really fascinating. I think this is my hot take. I think the technology I think it's real. I think it's really useful. I worry some organizations will misuse it entirely. I mean, because there's this new, right, you can analyze millions of data points to look at themes and track which developing narratives might potentially escalate into risk. And I think that is super valuable because it's forward looking, whereas what we typically do today is backwards looking with media monitoring, right? It's like what has happened, and that is a super valuable capability. And I think for comms people, absolutely valuable. I do wonder if it's. I feel like the real shift communicators need to start thinking about is less about like moving from monitoring the past or even like looking at potentially monitoring the future, but to thinking about like genuine strategy. And that shift it doesn't always happen with like, it happens because someone in the organization has the standing and the judgment to take what the tool has surfaced and actually do something with it upstream. So the tool is only as good as like the people interpreting it.
And the vision.
And exactly. And so narrative intelligence, because it's something we've been exploring at TAG as well. What I do think it does is it gives the upstream argument much better evidence. Instead of saying like, I have a feeling this might become a problem, you can say like, here's the projected arc of where we think this is going to go. So I think it's really exciting. I think, but the leaders have to figure out how to operationalize it and not just treat it as like a more expensive media monitoring service. Cause that's sort of where I have concerns it could potentially go.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that I finished reading this white paper and then doing some.
What were the insights? Like, did it accurately project where narratives were?
It was more of a principled approach to AI and narrative intelligence. But I finished reading it and I thought, I want to be the chief narrative intelligence officer of some company. I was like,
I love that.
I loved it. So I'll share it offline.
I love that. Please do. I would love to read it.
Yes. Jen, I also wanted to address how difficult is the CEO job today, right? These guys have a really tough job, and staying consistent
it's really tough
in this world is an art in itself. Staying consistent and staying out of trouble while continuing to drive value generation and business, right? So what any thoughts on what are the principles that CEOs should go by when it comes to, standing for the company?
It's so interesting, right? I mean, 10 years ago, a CEO could stay in their lane and focus on earnings and not say anything publicly or not very much. And the ecosystem pretty much left them alone. And what we have now is really quite different. It's pressure coming from every direction simultaneously. And sometimes the directions contradict each other. And what's so interesting, I was just doing a little digging on some of the commitments that were made in 2020, 2021, and how some of those are being walked, obviously they've been walked back, but now they're becoming, they're being litigated. And so it's interesting to think like what was considered best practice 4 or 5 years ago is now litigation exposure in 2026 when it comes to DE&I and ESG and all these things. So, I think when we think about neutral ground or staying out of trouble, I think all of that is sort of the wrong aspiration in my mind, because it leads to, defensive or like say nothing communications that basically it doesn't satisfy anybody. And it also signals that maybe you're like afraid, there's something you're afraid to say, right? We saw that play out in the DE&I reversal wave, all the companies, announcing rollbacks to their, due to activist pressure, which then just alienated the audiences who valued those programs without actually even appeasing the people who were campaigning against them. So they didn't stay out of trouble at all. They got the trouble anyway they just also then lost the credibility. And so one of the principles, the way I think about it is, instead of the principle being like stay silent or just don't say anything or don't, the better goal in my mind is to know whose trust you cannot afford to lose and to protect that. One of the first things I ask my teams when somebody flags a potential issue or sort of complaints around a practice or an initiative is like, okay, well, give me the data around who is saying this and how many of them are saying it, because you can't only look at the loudest voices. You can't optimize for the most activated people on social media. You can't optimize for the manufactured outrage campaign. And so underneath all of it, I think, we call it consistency. But when I think about consistency, I think what we're actually describing is like courage of conviction. It's a leadership quality, right? You think about the companies that went back on some of their commitments in last year and the year before, like Lowe's, or you think about like a John Deere, Target for sure. Like some of them genuinely lacked conviction. They borrowed a values position in 2020 because they thought the moment demanded it, but they never operationally embedded it. Some of them maybe had real conviction, but didn't have the courage to defend it when it got hard, when it got expensive. And so both, these are the leaders who come out of this period, in my mind, with real credibility, are going to be the ones who did the internal work before, all of the external pressure came. They knew what they stood for. They knew whose trust was foundational to the business, and they had made the decision in advance about what they were willing to pay to protect both of those things. And it's not that you can do that. It's not going to be perfect, and you're certainly not going to do it without mistakes. But you have to do it from a place that is real and material to the business. So I don't think there's no such thing as neutral ground today. It's a really, really hard. It's a really tough job to be in.
This warrants a 10-hour episode on all the different situations, especially.
I know, I'm like, and then.
I know, in the U.S., especially with the latest decisions from a government perspective on all things DE&I. There's actually a couple good episodes of the Communication Breakdown podcast.
I've not seen that one.
That discuss this, the DEI topic, and how IBM is now in trouble and litigating with the government, and they had to settle, walking back from a commitment that they took in 2020 or 2021, and exactly what you were describing. It's discussed in one of those episodes. Yeah,
it's so interesting if you think about it, though, right? Because truly, like 2020, 2021, like staying out of trouble meant you made these commitments,
committed,
right? Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then 4 or 5 years later, it is getting you in trouble. So yes. I think this goal of like, oh, well, we need to be neutral, we need to stay out of trouble. It's the wrong thing to be chasing. The thing to be chasing goes right back to your business strategy. It's not chasing the ether of like, who's talking about what. It is courage of conviction around who you need to be building, maintaining, and protecting trust with. Yeah. Maybe it could be that it's a certain subset of your consumer group. It could be that it's regulators. It could be it's going to depend on the industry and the organization. But know who you cannot afford to lose and protect that at all costs.
And that should be the North Star question, right?
Correct. That's right.
Good. One of the past episodes, we discussed something that I personally have not spent too much time thinking about, which is governance around reputation and making reputation a company-wide accountability, not just something that corporate affairs owns, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Philosophically, I fully subscribe to that. Practically speaking, I think it's a little bit more difficult because the dominant model in most organizations is still that reputation lives in corporate affairs. It gets handed to the CCO the way a lawsuit gets handed to the general counsel. And what's crazy, I mean, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 2/3 of a company's market value is attributed directly to reputation. And yet the function is always chronically underfunded. It's always, it's downstream from the decisions that are creating or destroying that value. And then, so that space between what reputation is worth, right? And how valuable it is, and then also how it's governed, I think is one of the most significant structural failures, quite honestly, in how modern organizations are run. A former CEO told me once that she never hires a head of strategy because strategy is the responsibility of the entire organization. And the moment you give one person that title, you've implicitly relieved basically everyone else of the obligation to think about strategy. Yeah. And I think about reputation the same way. I mean, the moment you put it in a box with a job title on it, or, you've created an environment where every other function is treating it as like it's not their problem. And I've been that person in that position. I've been the only one in a meeting saying, this thing it might work on your EBITDA flow through, but it's going to backfire on loyalty or whatever it is. And and that's a governance problem. It means the organization has not yet built reputation into its decision-making architecture. And so it becomes an afterthought. At TAG, at the Aspen Group, when I first started, one of the first things we built was a reputation index, which was like a real-time measurement framework that was tracking multiple dimensions simultaneously. And you could see how each of these sort of moved in relation to each other over time, which meant we could start to connect operational decisions to reputational outcomes in at least in a language the business could use and understand. And it's a first step. I think shared dashboards are great, but measurement alone does not solve that. And that's why I say philosophically, I absolutely subscribe to that. But I think practically it's much harder because the real fix is structural and it's cultural. I mean, it has to show up in how decisions get made, which means reputation impact should be an explicit evaluation criteria right alongside financial impact, which means CFOs and COOs and CHROs are going to have to understand that the thing that they're optimizing for in their function has reputational consequences that they also need to be responsible for. So the fact that this is even a conversation at the board level is progress, because it is, right? But we're still mostly in a world where reputation is what the comms team worries about, and everybody else sort of contributes to it accidentally until it shows up in the choices that get made. I don't think we've really moved the needle yet, and it ultimately has to start at the top.
I think we all should start our meetings with the board and the executive committees by saying you cannot PR your way out of operational failure, and that way that would instill some sense of urgency, therefore,
and accountability,
and therefore, involve me early and strategically, and perhaps we can avoid some of those downstream negative.
One of the other initiatives we looked at exploring, although we for a variety of reasons weren't able to build out, but we started to explore with Weber Shandwick, who's our agency of record, putting dollar values against certain reputational risks that we were intending to then bring to the board and actually show on a quarterly basis, like how much certain activities or inactivity cost the business. So things like, for example, a patient requests a refund or a customer requests a refund. Like, what is that? If we don't issue that refund, what is the reputational cost in media coverage, in Google review complaints, all of these things? If we do issue a $500 refund, it's $500, and so really trying to demonstrate that gap. And our finance team was really eager to have the conversation. So I think organizations are trying to find ways to to embed it more deeply into their business. But I think, again, like measurement alone and financial figures alone is a start, but it's
not the full picture.
It has to show up. Yeah, it's not the full picture, and it has to show up. Actually, it's still a lagging indicator. It has to show up beforehand. It has to show up in the decision-making process.
Yeah, I was actually also a month ago or so. I saw a demo of an AI-based platform that someone is developing that. Based on different scenarios and risks associated to a given company or brand, the platform can evaluate the potential impact on stock value, on share value.
Oh, wow.
If any one of those scenarios or situations basically unfold. So, yeah, I mean, maybe we'll get there someday.
Yeah. I mean, the output is only as good as the input. I mean, the other challenge is, sometimes you present these dashboards or these figures and the executives are like, well, how much are you putting against these variables? You know, and then it becomes like a mathematical whodunit. Like how did you actually get to those numbers?
It's all about the input, right? Yeah.
It is, yeah. But I look, I think any attempt to quantify and put rigor around this work is necessary and important to do, because without it, we're just continuing to fly blind.
And it will always be progress, right?
Correct, exactly. I couldn't agree more.
So Jen, we have a few more minutes, and I wish we had a few hours, but maybe
Me too.
Maybe we have a part 2. Listen, a couple more questions before we wrap up. One of them is about values and whether you remember a situation where your values conflicted with what your company was planning on doing or saying.
I mean, several times. I think the one that cost me the most personally happened at Headspace, actually, which makes it either ironic or educational, depending on how you look at it.
You needed some meditating after that, right?
I needed to meditate. Yeah, I really needed to go on a retreat. Headspace, mental health and wellness company, mindfulness, meditation, and that was the product and genuinely the culture. I had signed up for. I was at the time, as I was leading comms there, I was very, very pregnant with my second baby, and I'd been traveling internationally through just Australia to Germany, back to Germany to Portugal and France on this global media tour for several weeks. The schedule would have been aggressive for someone who wasn't 8 months pregnant, but I ended up hospitalized between trips for severe dehydration and risk of preterm labor. And the conflict I felt in that moment was just pure, cognitive dissonance, because the company I was representing to the world, right, the one that genuinely believed in well-being and work-life balance, and they genuinely did, and the reality I was living inside of it were not the same thing. And it's not that anyone was malicious, but because growth pressure and good intentions don't always automatically produce alignment, unfortunately, they can coexist very uncomfortably. I didn't, I don't even know if I told anyone at the time, to be honest. I didn't, but I recovered, I went back to work. But I thought about that experience a lot in terms of maybe what it taught me about between what a company says it stands for and how it actually operates, and how easy it is to be caught up in telling the story that you stop noticing when you're maybe living in the contradiction. And so in my experience anyway, the values conflict isn't always someone asks you to do something clearly wrong, right? Send a press release that has lies in it. It's much more of a slow burn when the culture kind of slowly normalizes something that isn't right, and you're so bought in that you help it along without meaning to.
Yeah.
But there are several times.
We all have been there. Thank you for sharing it. Anything that, as you think about the future, as it relates to reputation and comms and everything we do, anything in particular that excites you?
Oh, so much. So much excites me about reputation. I mean, look, we are living through a moment where the cost of inauthenticity has never been higher, and the reward for genuine trust has never been greater. And I find that deeply thrilling. If you think about, what's actually happening, right? All of our intangible assets, reputation, trust, brand, that they represent the majority of an enterprise value, an enterprise's value, at least for S&P 500, companies. The thing that the communications people have been arguing deserves a seat at the table for decades now, that argument is over because, in many ways, reputation has won. Layer on top of that what AI is doing to the information environment. When an AI summarizes who you are, it's drawing from all those earned media outlets that we have been pitching for such a long time. You can't buy your way into that summary. You can't, you either built something real or you didn't. So I think we're entering this period where one's reputation is a real competitive advantage with immeasurable financial return. I started the CCO Dispatch in a hotel room watching a very scary world unfold and feeling like, there had to be something useful I could do with what I was seeing. And I think what excites me is that the profession I've spent 25 years plus in is finally being understood for what it actually is, or at least valued for what it actually is. Not the people who write the press releases, but the people who help organizations figure out who they are and whether they have the courage to be that consistently when it matters most. The phrase, I'm forgetting his name, where he talked about being the translator between business logic and societal logic. I love that because I think that is the work communications leaders can uniquely do. And I think it's the most exciting time to be in communications. We just need the courage to lead.
Yes. Well said. Anything we have not discussed that you'd like to bring up?
I don't think so. Not that I can think of.
Good. So I think we're going to be wrapping up. And again, I'm not discarding the possibility of a part 2, Jen, because this has been great. So as long as you are in, and my headline for today may be a little bit surprising because it's not so much about reputation, but it's more about leadership and a concept that we've been talking about and that has become recurrent across the different episodes of this podcast. But I loved it how Jen put it, and so I'll repeat her words. Curiosity is a professional discipline, not just a personality trait. So I love that.
Did I say that? Wow.
You did. I was taking notes. I'll send you the recording.
Sometimes I surprise myself.
Jen, thank you so much. This was fun, this was insightful, and above all, inspiring. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Javier, thank you for doing what you're doing. These conversations, I have been voraciously listening to every episode, and I just have to say, these are some of the most thought-provoking and nuanced and really smart conversations, and we need more of them. So thank you for contributing so much to the profession.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, and that's actually the objective of this podcast. For everybody else, again, thank you so much for listening. And also, as I always say, if you guys enjoyed the conversation, make sure to subscribe to this podcast, to share it with your network, and in this case, also subscribe and follow Jen's The CCO Dispatch newsletter on LinkedIn. Thank you and have a good day.